Hello everybody, I, Eric Lin, Justin Dang, and Arnav Malhotra will be presenting Chapter 2, Truman and the Cold War. To start off, the USA and its relationship with communism pre-1945 was often that of anxiety, as for many Americans, communism suppressed human rights at home and were a expansionist nation abroad. The US also feared for its safety as communist ideologies spread. Like, what were to happen if the world became filled with communists? Historian Martin McCauley emphasized that both parties were convinced of the expansionist plans of the other. This began in 1918 when American troops intervened in Russia to prevent a communist regime. Due to the US believing that the USSR was promoting worldwide communist revolutions, the US refused to acknowledge its existence, only doing so in 1933 because they needed a trading partner during the Great Depression. Relations remained uneasy till Adolf Hitler declared war on the US and both the Soviet Union and America became allies against Nazi Germany. In 1945, some contemporaries and historians believed in the continuing cooperation between the US and USSR. However, others saw it as a marriage of convenience and that a Cold War was inevitable. The start of the Cold War begins with the Grand Alliance formed when Hitler attacked the USSR in 1941 and Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, resulting in the USA, USSR, and Britain to form the Grand Alliance. However, it didn't operate smoothly due to distrust. This was evident when the US kept Stalin in the dark about the atomic bomb that he found out through his own spies. Stalin remained bitter about it. Stalin was able to establish communist regimes in Eastern Europe when advancing, creating what he considered a security zone, whereas the US perceived it as aggression. However, there has been cooperation, as Stalin was willing to wait 3 months to invade Japan after winning in Germany, which could have been seen as either a helpful ally or a greedy opportunist trying to get their share of the spoils of war. By 1945, President Roosevelt in April died, leaving Harry Truman in his place with a very strong America as resources in Europe were drained, while the US remained untouched. For example, Russia had 30 million people dead. Not only that, but Western Russia's industry and agricultural sectors were damaged by Germany's invasion. However, their two traditional enemies, Germany and Japan, were defeated, and they gained a variety of fast developing communist states in Eastern Europe and became the second place in terms of power in the world. Historians have debated why the Cold War began, some seeing the USA as the aggressor while others saw Stalin as the aggressor, and some blame both. The orthodox interpretation pointed at Stalin's aggression and the takeover of Eastern Europe. The revisionists blamed American desire to export US products and its capitalist system, as the takeover of Eastern Europe would have shut off potential markets for US products. The post-revisionists argued that mutual incomprehension and misunderstanding played an important role in the start of the Cold War. However, many American historians who were revisionists became more orthodox and conservative as the years passed. Ultimately, the post-revisionists are right, as both countries had expansionist ideologies and their leaders having differing personalities.
Okay, now coming into Chapter 4, we can see the Truman Doctrine and containment coming into existence. After World War II ended, tensions between Soviet Russia and the United States were getting worse. Stalin was acting in Greece and Turkey in ways that were making the Western world of America and Churchill very concerned. During World War II, Roosevelt and Churchill recognized Stalin's interest in Turkey, and that led him to feeling justified in putting pressure on Turkey and gaining a naval base and naval access after the war was over. After this, and the fact that the US believed that Stalin had helped the Greek communists in a revolution, Truman was inspired to give a speech to Congress that eventually became the foundation of the future Truman Doctrine. He asked for money to aid the people in Greece and Turkey against communist actions. Something that promoted Truman's speech was a year earlier when State Department Soviet specialist George Kennan sent a telegram to try and rile people up against Soviet expansionism. He claimed that Moscow and Russia was their entire policy was based on expanding their territory, revolutionary communist ideology, and Stalin's paranoid suspicions to the Western world. Truman believed in Keenan's assessment, leading to his policy of containment and future development of the Truman Doctrine. This assessment led to the US getting involved in unnecessary wars like in Korea and Vietnam, as well as the big arms race between Soviet Russia and the US that dominated foreign policy for much of this time period, and later created things like the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine led to the Marshall Plan giving more money to European countries to prevent countries falling to communism. People looking back on the situation disagree with if Truman and Keenan were true in their actions, with one side believing the USSR was very aggressive and the other believing that Truman led the US into unfavorable conditions in places that they shouldn't be in. One such journalist that believes in Truman being very aggressive in his actions was Walker Lippmann, pictured below, where he called the Truman Doctrine a global policy and an ideological crusade that had no limits, that would lead to a constant Cold War with the USSR for years and possibly ever. The images on this slide are demonstrative of this section of Chapter 2, with the first image in the top left being of containment policies and how the US was spinning what the USSR was doing to gain sympathy in the public. It's sort of like propaganda. The one below it is a picture of Uncle Sam with a bag for Greece and Turkey, referencing to the Truman Doctrine, how it was formed since Truman wanted to give Greece and Turkey money so they wouldn't become communist. Along with it is a spin wheel, which would eventually show what the beginnings of NATO, as that also occurred during this time period. And the image on the far right is like the second image, just demonstrating Uncle Sam and the idea of giving aid to Turkey and Greece. Section 5 of this chapter brings the impacts to other nations into play from the last section through Latin America and its impacts from the Truman Doctrine. What Truman wanted and what the Latin American governments wanted greatly differed from each other, leaving Latin Americans very disappointed. One side was very focused on communism, and the other side just wanted economic help and just industrialization, things that they didn't have at this time period. Latin Americans believed that if they helped the US with their fight against communism, they'd be able to get something in return for their help. Sort of like a Marshall Aid Doctrine plan, but instead of for Europe, it would be for them. But they were unable to gain such a thing. When the Rio Conference was held and a Rio Treaty was signed between Latin American countries, the US, and all of the American countries, with Latin American nations believed that what they did helping the US would help them gain something or favor with the US, but they gained nothing out of this and had believed later that they had gone on with this for no reason. Some nations who helped the treaty get signed were left with nothing, and they were told by others that they were less important compared to what the other nations were doing in Europe that are more susceptible to communism. Everything to the US was focused on a Cold War perspective, and everything had to do with communism, no matter what it was. For example, one time a protest broke out in Colombia at a 1948 Bogota conference, and the US immediately assumed the worst and that communism was the reason for these riots, even though there were many other factors such as the current political state of the country of Colombia was at that time, and people were dissatisfied. Later, in 1949, 2 years later, Truman created a small program called the Point 4 Technical Assistance Program. This program was used to promote technological, scientific, managerial, and economic self-help in less developed countries. However, this program was spread out across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, making the Latin America seem less of a focus of American politics and just as an image that, oh, we're doing good for other countries. they were not able to gain much overall compared to the rest of the world when it came to help from the United States from the Truman Doctrine. This last image or slide of images is demonstrative of this last slide in the last section I just talked about, with the first image in the top left being a logo for the Point 4 program. The one below it is a book written by a political historian about foreign policy during this time period and was a big influence on some parts of this world perception. The one after this is the OAS, which is a group founded during this period between all of America, which was very good in showing hemispheric disunity due to the Truman Doctrine, as Latin Americans were dissatisfied with what the US was giving them. And then the very right, just an image of the countries that were affected by these actions.
Continuing on from Arnov, I'll be talking about how during Truman's presidency, the government and Cold War situations changed greatly, influencing the culture inside the US in a multitude of ways. It all started with the Red Scare, which followed the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. It appeared during Truman's presidency and gave more power to the right-leaning political side. Right-wingers investigated left-wingers for socialism and communism through HWAC, which is the House of Representative Committee. Truman believed that the premise of the Red Scare was an attack on free speech because the Bill of Rights protects free belief and free speech. But speech that reflects communists caused people to be hunted down. Specifically, the implementation of the Internal Security Act disrupted free speech of citizens through its quick investigations of communism, despite Truman attempting to veto it. Citizens were afraid to go out as a consequence because of the fears of being accused as a communist. Black grew during this time of increasing fears and hunted down many people for being communist. One of these groups includes the Hollywood 10. When the writers/directors were convicted of communism, it further contributed to the atmosphere of fear of being convicted. Black stopped many people besides the Hollywood 10, including 500 state and local government employees. 600 school teachers and 150 professors lost their jobs to communist accusations. McCarthy fanned the fears of communism in the political sphere. Specifically, he caused rumors about Tidings, causing him not to get elected as Senate president, and Stevenson for Democratic president. While all this hysteria was going on within the US, Truman was having an intense Cold War with the Soviet Union. They competed against each other in the space race to see who could get into space the quickest. In the arms race, one of the biggest developments included the Soviets' creation of the first atomic bomb, which exploded in 1949 to 1950. As a result, the US taught their students a way to survive a nuke through Bert the Turtle practice drills, which focused on them hiding under tables and praying. Around this time, China became communist, and coincidentally, a poll revealed 73% believed Truman to be soft on the Soviets. McCarthy, a large cause of the Red Scare, assisted in the US getting into the Korean War. Because of this, the societal culture began to change as African Americans began to desegregate in the Cold War. They were more socially accepted by the government for their achievements. Furthermore, the American culture changed with religion, education, and free time throughout this time. Religion focused on fighting communism through figures like preacher Billy Graham, who warned 25 million per week against communism. The way the government prepared people against communism was through the National Defense Education Act, which funded future scientists/mathematicians. They did this in hopes of speeding up the space race or the arms race. Another result was that generally books avoided communism, while the film industry focused on making the Cold War space and arms race a success through promoting science fiction.